My conversation today is with author, scholar, and practitioner David Rankine. David has been a major contributor to the communities of occultism, magic, and the Western esoteric traditions, with a list of publications dating back to the 1980s. David has recently released a 2-volume work through Hadean Press entitled the Grimoire Encyclopedia, which has been called a work of unparalleled magical scholarship. To be sure, this endeavor is as historic as it is useful, with over 100 chapters and 8 massive appendices. The work is a staggering presentation of multiple decades of research and experience. David is not only one of the most well-researched authors I have spoken with, he's also one of the most extensively practiced. His insights into the multi-layered discipline of magical evocation are an incredible boon to practitioners of all sectors of magical operation. It was a delight speaking with such an accomplished and incredibly affable practitioner and to glean insights from his wealth of experience. I'm Ike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast. I guess I want to start off with, you having recently released the Grimoire Encyclopedia. If social media and, being somewhat plugged into the occult communities is any indication, it's been released to great success. So I congratulate you on that. You're known for your work in the Grimoire tradition with Stephen Skinner and your standalone works and things of that nature. But what was the impetus to take on a project of this size?
It's been a long time coming, I think. Back in 2010, a good old friend of mine, Mog Morgan, who I knew from Oxford from the 80s, contacted me and said, "You're into all this grimoire stuff. I don't really get it. Could you do me a précis of the most important grimoires?" So I did a document for him, which was a paragraph each on what I considered at the time the most important 30 grimoires. So, and that was kind of like the seed being planted, I think, in a sense. And then as the years went by, more and more people were releasing more and more good works. The scope of what is out there in the last 10, 15 years has just expanded so much. There's so many good books out there and good people doing the scholarship and the practice and making stuff available. Therefore, for people who are coming into the grimoires, it could be a bit overwhelming. It's just such a vast, where do you start? And I decided that maybe somebody should do an overview of the whole tradition. And I thought about those 30 paragraphs I'd written, and it kind of went from there. I started writing chapters, and and as I started on it, I didn't have a set number planned. I created my initial plan of how I thought the book would be structured, which changed over the 3 years that I wrote it. And reached a point where I said, okay, 100 is a good number. It's a nice round number. If I don't have a cut-off point, I'll never actually stop and get it out there. And the whole point of this work is to try and put this book out there that hopefully people are going to find of value, as a resource, so that they can look at the grimoires, see what attracts them, see what they can then go on, like the good books other people have written that I put in the essential reading for every chapter. Because, like I say, there's a lot of people doing good work. You've got, people like, obviously, Joe Pete and Stephen Skinner, but people like Frater Atcher and Dan Harms and Steve Savedow and Al Cummings and, of course, Jake Stratton Kent. And there's so many people who've been doing, great work that I wanted this book to also signpost people to all of the work they've done. So there's a particular grimoire, they can go, oh, yeah, so-and-so's written a book on that. That I should read that to find out more about this particular grimoire, because that's maybe the one I want to work with. And the appendixes as well just kind of snowballed.
Yes, as they do. It's interesting. I recall having several thoughts of, somebody should write a book on this, or somebody should put all this stuff together. But I commend you for having the gumption to actually get it done. And I guess, you've got what now, 4 decades of practice?
Yeah, over 4 decades.
Right. So, I mean, that plus the scholarly tack that you specifically take, the amount of detail that you've put into all of the stuff. I think a lot of kind of it's sort of that consideration of this work tends to fly over people's heads sometimes, the minutia and things like that. So it probably, I guess after putting out all the work that you have, it kind of seemed like a little bit more of a feasible task eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I've already got I suppose probably over a dozen or so books on the grimoires that I had worked on by myself, or Stephen Skinner and I did like half a dozen books together. The whole point when we founded Golden Horde back in 2003 was to put out and make available, rare and inaccessible works. And from that, I just felt it really needed somebody to tackle it. And that panoramic view, it shows the tradition in a much wider, bigger light. And I think people have been looking at it. People have been looking at pieces of it rather than the whole thing. And when you look at the whole thing, suddenly things change.
Yeah, and from what I understand, you're a in terms of the Western magical traditions, I correct me if I'm wrong, but you're fairly widely practiced. I mean, you began with more of the Golden Dawn derivative stuff early on, correct? And then you moved to the grimoires.
Well, I mean, the first lodge I was in, which was Stella Matutina derived, did tend to focus a lot on grimoire material, so I was getting that there. Then I moved into like Thelemic stuff, Alexandrian, Wicca, but like the grimoire stuff, and grimoires and Kabbalah have kind of always been there in the background or the foreground, depending on what time in my life it was. Over the years, they've always been there. So other things have been, I suppose, satisfied my interest in other areas, but yeah, the grimoires, I suppose that is the underlying one that's always there, and that's what motivated me to try and take on the task of, to an extent, codifying the material for people so that they can just go and look at the books and go, wow, okay, so I'm interested in this particular spirit. It turns up in these grimoires. Okay, I'm looking at these grimoires. Okay, this one appeals to me. I'll maybe work with this. Oh, so and so has written a book on this. I'll get that as well. And so open, to just try and open doors and pathways for people, right, to do grimoire practice.
Yeah, I have a question for you. That's kind of a big question. Some people, my background, obviously, for anybody that has listened to this podcast for any length of time, knows that I came from the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn by way of this sort of strange happenstance. But the grimoire stuff has only been, even though, Mathers did I would say a debatably adequate job translating the some of the Solomonic stuff, but it certainly was there in the early GD stuff. But it's new for me in the past year to really begin diving into that stuff, particularly after conversations with Dr. Skinner and magicians more well versed in Goetic and magic and the grimoire traditions. But one of the questions that I had was, I see this hard line kind of delineated, and on one side, and I think it's a product actually of like what you're saying, seeing the systems piecemeal and not having the broad overview. But I see this hard line drawn in some communities of grimoire practitioners where they won't necessarily consider stuff outside of the evocation, binding and pacts with spirits as magical. And Dr. Skinner actually, he mentions quite famously in the techniques of Greco-Egyptian magic, this idea of there being a technique that didn't, this difference between magic and the mysteries. And we're seeing more and more of that, as these communities sort of just grow. They're just expanding at lightning speed right now. It feels, I've been doing this for almost 20 years now as well, and it's very different in the last 5 years or so. But there's this whole kind of, goetic magic versus theurgy. So I'm interested to hear your take on that. I mean, do you consider the more theurgic practices to contain an element of magic, or do you just kind of exclusively consider the grimoire stuff?
Absolutely. I mean, and there's elements of theurgy in some of the grimoires. I mean, like I say, with that overview, there's three main themes running through the grimoires, which is conjuration, divination, and the simple spell and charm stuff. So straight away, you'll find them in different proportions in each of the grimoires. You immediately go, conjuration is not the only theme there. In a lot of respects, conjuration is kind of the last resort if the other simpler stuff hasn't worked. And for me, magic is not just about ritual. I think that's where sometimes people get hung up on doing rituals all the time. Magic is about how you engage with the world. It's about, the respect you have for every other living thing and for the dead, for your ancestors. It's very much a way of being. So ritual is a part of that, but it's not all of it. And I think people get hung up on, I have to do this conjuration, I have to do that conjuration. It's like, why? And actually, do you? A lot of the time, you really don't. There's simpler ways to do it. There's this description of, in sort of ancient Egyptian stuff, I really like, of one of the earliest descriptions of magic. Say, Heka, magic was given to man by Ra to ward off the arrows of fate. And I really like that whole thing, that when you're doing ritual, you're shifting probabilities of an event happening in your favor. That's normally, whether that event happening is with the assistance of a spirit or just by your own, will, whatever it might be. At the end of the day, that's what you're doing with the magic. And so I'm a great believer in the KISS principle, keep it simple. So if you don't need to do big complex stuff, why do it? Conjurations, for me, they're like an occasional thing. It's not, and with all the preparation as well that goes in, if you're living a busy life, okay, planning aside, when it actually comes to doing a conjuration, that's a week out of your life going to be gone. With the purificatory stuff beforehand, and
right,
and pretty much dropping off the map, because I'm as I mentioned in the Grimoire Encyclopedia, great believer in the electronic fast, and that you are minimizing external influences that will distract you from that one pointed focus you want to have for the conjuration. So it's for big stuff that you do that. And I think once you are in a situation where you've acted, then it doesn't necessarily need to be these big conjurations, because you've got that relationship then with a spirit, and the style of working changes to a simpler form. But the theurgy side of it, no, I mean, because a lot of people might disagree, but I think that it's also, the idea of like the great work. Some people feel that's a bit cliche now, but it's the work of making yourself great. It's of realizing your own genius and becoming the best you can be. And through making yourself great, through trying to evolve the species as well. The whole point of life is to evolve, and we want to evolve as a species as well, not just as individuals. So magic for me is totally tied up with that. And so the theurgic and the mystical is an essential component of that attitude. I think it's very important. And if you get wrapped up in the grimoires as an isolated tradition, then there are problems that can come with that, because you look at every tradition through history, none of them, unless they're on some island in the middle of the Pacific or something, existed in isolation. They cross-fertilized with other traditions. Now we see cross-fertilization between the grimoires and some of the ATRs, for example, which is really fruitful and productive. But there's also, I think, necessary cross-fertilization from the ceremonial magic of the last 100 years or so. If you're doing grimoire stuff, you should have good mental muscles. You should have been, have all those years of meditation and concentration exercises and other things under your belt, to so that you can be focused, so that you can shut off your internal dialogue, so that if you're the person who's engaging with the spirit, that is the spirit that you're engaging with, and you're not just talking to your ego in your head. There's all these other factors that come in. So I think you can't be too much of a purist. You need to be open to being in a world that is, in a lot of respects, without borders. When it comes to magic, really, we don't have the borders there. There's so much cross-fertilization, and that, I think, is by and large a good thing. I mean, I'm not saying that it might be inappropriate at times to culturally appropriate, but there's a difference between cultural appropriation and seeing something that works and finding if there's other ways of doing that are appropriate for your tradition.
Yeah,
so I've gone off a rant there, but
no, that's excellent. I was just about to say, I'd love to hear you say that. To me, the theurgic and the goetic are two uses of the same system. A lot of it is based in this early Hellenistic cosmology, and there's this whole kind of unified terminology, and you're utilizing spirits, in theurgy. You're calling on the daimones and the planetary intelligences and the planetary spirits to say it. Even if you look at the work of Martina de Pasquale, with the Elu Cohen, he was using a Solomonic system, the phylacteries, the magic circles, but he was using it, for theurgy specifically, where he was calling in, him and his sort of lay priests that he consecrated were engaged in this universal or at least terrestrial exorcism. But they were using, it was all culled from grimoire traditions and things like that. But that kind of leads me to the next point. There's this idea that, the grimoire traditions as we receive them are, and, in some variations of it, they're largely Judeo-Christian. And a lot of people are pointing back to things like the technical Hermetica, the PGM, the Greek Magical Papyri, and things like that. What are your thoughts on, having studied as widely as you have, what are your thoughts on the origins, quote unquote, of these things?
Well, I think there's like three main threads going into the grimoires, and the sort of that stuff in the PGM and the Greek Goes and that side of things is one of them. Obviously, the Jewish magic is also another one, and then also from the Arabic. And the Arabic stuff is in itself already, in a sense, preserving some of the lost Hellenic material, as well as the influence which we haven't really scratched the surface of yet, of Indian magic, and how much of an influence into the grimoires there may be through the Arabic from Indian influences. Mansions of the Moon, for example, comes from Indian astrology via the Greeks into the Arabic, into the grimoires.
Oh, wow. I didn't know that.
Yeah. So, and the whole idea of the Almandal as well, from the mandala. There's there are elements there that need to be explored more. This is something I mentioned, I think, in the introduction of the Grimoire Encyclopedia, that there's whole areas of study still there to expand the tradition more, which is why I think we're actually living in very exciting times, that we have so many people, doing good work and, looking at the different areas. But yeah, I totally agree with you. The Goetic and the Theurgic, I think they both work, and you can work them both without, they don't have to exclude each other. It's like I might do one thing with my left hand and one thing with my right hand. That doesn't mean that I'm only going to use one of those hands. And sometimes I might need both of those hands for something.
Yeah. There's that. You know, you're probably aware, but that's this kind of, debate going on between quote unquote camps, and that kind of, I believe there's an academic term for it, right? And I think anthropology and something like that, they call it the narcissism of small differences, things like that. So I see a lot of that happening, but I mean, you are somebody who I'm just glad to hear you say that. I think a lot of people will benefit from having heard it. One thing that I actually I was wondering, and I think I spoke to Aaron Leach a little bit about this. What are your opinions on substitutions in the prescribed materia magica? You know, not everybody is either willing or can easily obtain animal parts and things like that.
Yeah. I've talked a bit again in the book and elsewhere about the idea of magical momentum, and when you're doing an operation of building up the magical momentum, and I think you can make substitutions that will work without really having a negative effect on the magical momentum. I mean, it depends on, you have to be able to justify for it to work. There has to be a coherence and a logic to that substitution. And if there is, I don't see a problem with it. Magic, again, as I've said before, draws on the religion and the technology of the age. And that's why so much of the Grimoire stuff is, essentially, like we said, Judeo-Christian, with that influence as well from Islamic, so Abrahamic. But there are those earlier roots coming in from the Greek and the Egyptian, from the earlier influences into the Jewish things like the Macabre tradition and other sources. And I don't think that if they had things available, they would have necessarily used all those ingredients back in the day. You look at some of the French black magic grimoires, for example, and they come from a time where these people are doing the stuff out in the countryside. So some of the ingredients they're using are things that were very easily available to them. And there were a lot of cats around, and toads and things. So yeah, it's easy, you can virtually fall over them. Easy to get them and get parts from them. So substitution, I think, if it's if there is a logic to it and a coherence, is a very, very valid to do. I was talking at the weekend at a conference, and I mentioned there the thing I say in the book, that like with burning incense, it's the fragrance that attracts the spirits. You don't have to have a room, if you're indoors, full of smoke that's causing people to choke or is going to trigger somebody's asthma or whatever. So because it's fragrance, there's no reason why you can't use oil burners, and you're still getting the fragrance. And in fact, you can add other elements in for using the oil burners, which might not be present with burning incense. So I think that's a perfectly valid substitution. And then you would just, for example, make an appropriate fragrance to the same sort of recipe as an incense and burn that. So yeah, I think substitution is valid if done coherently and logically.
Mm-hmm. And do you find that you mentioned a little earlier, and I've heard other practitioners really lean on this particular idea of forming a relationship with the spirits. And now, do you think a lot of maybe I guess you'd consider boilerplate correspondences and attributions, say like things like planetary incenses, are those things that you have found in practice should be adhered to, or is it more of kind of this nuanced thing of finding out what a particular spirit really likes over time in order to conjure them?
I think they're a good starting point, and then once the relationship is there, they might, as you say, give you very specific preferences that they have for a recipe that you use to conjure them, that makes the process a lot simpler. that's the one that instantly grabs their attention. So yeah, I think they have their value, but they're the good introduction. Afterwards, you may then find things change.
It's like music. you learn your scales and then improvise.
Yeah, I mean, the grimoires exactly. Learn the system, and then when you know the system of a grimoire, then you can start to modify. But actually know the mechanics of the system, and generally, it's a case of adding in rather than taking out. Most grimoires, they're not complete books. People were writing down the stuff they wanted to remember. Other stuff they would just, if they knew by heart, why would they need to record it? So a lot of those grimoires, it was the key stuff that they wanted to remember. So there's practices which might not be included, but that are good to include, on what you already have in that grimoire, which will add to the momentum and not detract from the validity of the practice.
So, and I've also heard you talk about, or I may have read it, the role that divination plays in a lot of the grimoire tradition. Is that something that you incorporate into your own practice to a greater or lesser extent?
Occasionally, this is actually something that I suppose came more into my thoughts about 10 years ago. Joe Lisewski back then contacted me and we became friends. We used to, for a period of years, we used to like chat every Sunday evening for an hour or two. And he asked me to do a divination for a particular conjuration he wanted to do. Heptameron conjuration. It's no secret that was his big things. And I thought, okay, if I'm going to do this, I'm not just going to do tarot reading because he asked for tarot reading. I asked, for the details so that I knew exactly which magic circle, names and everything he would be doing, the timing, etc. And I created the same magic circle, and I did the tarot reading in the magic circle after having done like prayers to the particular archangel he was going to invoke. So I quite closely reproduced a lot of the details of the ceremony he was going to do, as and then to focus in on the reading to give it more focus on that to give a better reading. I was like trying to put the magical momentum into that tarot reading so that I could give him the best reading possible. And several things were pointed out as things that were likely to be obstacles, which he was then able, when they happened in his day-to-day life, to deal with, and that they didn't interfere with. And it worked really well. So that was me making the divination more complex than I normally would. So it was more, like I say, it was a grimoire tarot reading. And that made me appreciate that really, if you're doing a big operation, getting some insights beforehand is a good thing. The fact that those potential pitfalls that I saw and was able to relay to him, which he was then able to avoid, which otherwise might have interfered with the success of his conjuration, made me appreciate that, divination, if you're going to do a conjuration, I think is a good thing to do.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to do stuff for all kinds of operations. Of any significance, I'll appeal to. Tarot is obviously also my preferred method, but it's interesting. I love the idea that you did it you recreated the circle, which that's a really cool idea. Actually, that's something that I've never done. Although something of interest to me is the fact that, particularly in the system espoused by the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, anytime you do a tarot reading, you're doing a ritual tarot reading. You're not just setting up your LBRP and then, you know, setting up shop in the corner of a cafe or something like that. It's more so there are specific spirits. I would say it's a hierarchy that you're invoking. And I found actually, as usage of this particular method progresses, that the tarot cards, it's very difficult to articulate this. But so the only thing I can really say is that they seem to have a personality. You know, it seems to be, they almost have a spirit in them kind of speaking back to me after this, you know, doing this particular type of invocatory tarot work.
Absolutely. I still have the same cloth deck I bought when I was 18, so that I've been using that deck for 40 years. And I definitely feel that the cards have a spirit, you know, do have a distinct spirit to them, and, you know, very unique personalities. Like, there's, you know, I'll draw certain cards and it won't say in your books on tarot, this card means this, but I know if I draw it, it flipping well does, because that's what I've learned over 40 years of working with it. That, or this in combination with this, okay, that's something that I need to watch out for. I definitely feel like they do. And like I say, if you're using them in that more heavily invocatory ritual way, yeah, I definitely feel they draw, you know, the essence permeates them, and you know, image magic is a hugely significant part of the grimoires. You think of all of the seals and sigils, all that stuff. And what was called astral magic back then, as referring to the heavens and the influence of the heavens here, not the idea of the astral plane and astral projection stuff that it is now. That's not, you know, what astral magic meant centuries back. So yeah, I think they do become a powerful magical tool, which you have a relationship with. In the same way that you have a relationship with a spirit, I think over a period of time you have a relationship with your tarot deck. It does become like a friend that you engage with, and that is also not afraid to give you a smack across the face and say, "No, that's a dumb idea. You don't want to do that, mate."
So you're somebody who's been active in the occult and esoteric communities, as we mentioned, for quite some time now. You've been very influential in various sectors of those communities as well. As of recently, I guess where you stand today, how have you seen it change most impactfully?
I think for me, one of the things I've seen, I mean, the rise of the grimoires, but not just the grimoires, but folk magic. I think people are working far more with spirits now than they did, say, in the 80s or the 90s. I'm also happy to see that there is more respect for the dead and for ancestors and working with the spirits of the dead, because I think, you know, Crowley kind of had this attitude, you know, spiritualism is akin to necromancy, and seemed to have a real issue with this, which I think permeated the Western mystery tradition, so that there's been almost like an aversion to working with the dead very much, you know, or you'll get pagans who honor the dead once a year at Samhain, and not for the rest of the year. But, you know, I came up with a saying that, you know, any living tradition honors its dead. And
I love that.
I think that is something that has come in a lot more. I think a lot of this stuff has come through cross-fertilization from the ATRs, you know, from things like Santeria and Kimbanda and other traditions like that, that they've reminded people of the things that are important. And particularly, you know, the spirit work, the respect for spirits, the respect for the dead, and the sacredness of the life that you're living. So yeah, I think those are the big sort of, what I'd say, the positive changes that I've seen in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah, there's definitely been an explosion. I've not been around as long, but yeah, it's been kind of jarring to me a little bit, in a good way, right? I mean, I have a YouTube channel and a podcast, so it's working out. But to see more material available for people starting out, there's a tremendous amount of confusion. Like you're saying, these ideas of astral magic and these ideas of necromancy and things like that. I mean, it's even my opinions in the short period of time I've been doing this podcast, just under a year now, have changed from speaking to people like yourself, just because of more perspectives and more information. But I think the key is the quality of the information you're getting, right? The sources. I think that's super important. I mean, let's just say for somebody who's listening to this podcast right now, and is getting started. I mean, do you have like 2 or 3 main things that maybe you wish somebody had told you when you were starting out, or that you'd recommend to people nowadays heading down this path?
I think heading down any magical path, the world has changed a lot since I started. Don't put societal norms onto your magical path. We live in a quick fix, instant gratification society now. That does not gel with a magical path. You need to put in the work. You need the discipline and the persistence and the passion to get somewhere in magic. It's not a quick fix. It is, years of dedication, doing daily stuff, developing your mental muscles, your strength of will, being true to your word, and never breaking a promise. That side of things. So I think what I would say to people is be prepared that magic is, if you're starting now, it's a lot of work. It changes you, because even if you go in with slightly grey or dubious intentions, I think the longer you practice magic, the more ethical it makes you. If you are actually practicing magic and not paying lip service to it, the more ethical you become, in that the more you see the need to serve the world and to express compassion. So for me, it's be aware that it will change you, and it is a lot of hard work, but that it's also like incredibly rewarding. I think the magical path, it opens you up to worlds that you'd never see. I mean, we now have incredible CGI. We have, like films that have all these amazing images, but that can't even begin to compare to the first time that you actually have an encounter with a spirit and have that certainty of the reality of it. It shakes your universe. That first moment that, yes, it is all real and I can do this, gives you that bedrock to sort of go forward and really progress in magic. It becomes certainty, not faith. And once you have that moment, then there's no going back. And you can tell with people if they've had that experience, because it just shows in the way they are and how they talk about things and express themselves.
That's great advice. One of my favorite things that you mentioned, and that I've just kind of observed since the Grimoire Encyclopedia has come out, is the fact that you are listing recommended reading. I think that that's excellent, not only as a resource for people who are trying to find their way to credible information about specific things, but it's also highlighting other authors and other practitioners, particularly, which is really cool. And I'm curious, I know how these things go, especially if you have like a scholarly thing. You're more privy sometimes to I would say translation or scholarly works that are kind of happening at the moment, but won't hit the public for a while. But I'm interested to know if there are any newer authors working in the grimoire tradition, or any other, like, maybe translations of manuscripts that you know about that are really exciting to you right now.
So yeah, there's some really exciting things happening with people who aren't new, but are like hitting a resonance with the work they're doing. You know, like, I mean, Frata Accia's been around a long time, but I think Goetic atavisms is like really striking a chord for a lot of people, and you know, making people sit up and take notice. There's people like my magical brother Steve Savedal. You know, he's one of the pioneers of the grimoire revival, and he's producing material that's like really exciting and fresh. His new book, The Hidden and True Pneumatology, translated from the German. It's a really interesting text. It's a lot of stuff in there that, again, you're like, whoa. I mean, for example, there's a Hecate prayer in it, which immediately makes you stand up and take notice. Really interesting other material, discussions of spirits, discussion with a spirit. There's a sort of recording of this conjuration that a monk did of one of the Olympic spirits and what the Olympic spirit said to him. So that's the sort of thing you don't see recorded very often. That's really interesting. The work of Mihai Vatajaru is always really good. You know, he's a really good scholar. His blog is a fantastic resource, and he gets enough attention or credit for the amazing work that he's doing. Andrew Philip Smith recently had pages from a Welsh cunning man's book come out, which translated stuff from Welsh into English. And again, there's like the Welsh aspects of the grimoire tradition has been pretty much ignored. So I find it pretty exciting that we've got somebody translating material from Welsh, which is not an easy language, into English. And then there's this whole wave of women writing about the grimoires and related material, which kind of puts paid to that old notion of the grimoire tradition being, you know, a very male thing. It isn't. And, you know, it's being demonstrated by people like Alison Sikorsky, Sarah Mastros. She's got a new book coming out, Sorcery of Solomon, which I've seen, you know, before it goes to print. It's a really good standalone book on working with the Solomonic Pentacles, and that's a really nice work. And other people like Katerina Petrovich, Sasha Ravich, Marja Merling, Winter Armada. I've seen some of her forthcoming Codex of Beelzebub, and that's going to be a must-have book. You know, so there's a lot of people producing really interesting work, and I'm lucky in that I quite often get to see stuff before it goes to print, and that's a privilege I never take for granted. You know, I feel quite honoured that, you know, people will say, "Can you know, have a look at this?" And I get to see, you know, books before they go to print, at sometimes, you know, for an endorsement or for comments, and I'm very grateful for that, because it does mean you get to see stuff that's really fresh and, you know, coming out, and that you can see, oh, this is going to have an impact on, you know, what people think and practice. So there's a lot of exciting good stuff coming.
I wanted to ask you about practical components of the grimoire tradition and some of the things that you've included in the practical section of the Grimoire Encyclopedia. Things like, you know, casting the magical circle.
Yeah, that's, again, it's the case, I think, a lot that things are really obvious when you've been doing them, but not so obvious to people who haven't done them yet. Once you see it done, it's like, oh yeah, of course. But, you know, it's like the thing of, you see in a lot of the conjurations that often, like, the divine names are highlighted. They'll be like in a bold black, or they'll be in red, which indicates that you're supposed to vibrate those names. But if no one tells you that, you don't know. You know, that there is more emphasis on those divine names or the names of the spirits, or that anytime there's a cross, that you make the sign of the cross. Again, once you know, it's like, oh yeah, okay, that makes sense. But if you don't know until you see, or you see someone do it, because people don't tend to write about this. That's why I tried to put stuff like that into the Grimoire Encyclopedia and the magic circle. You know, it's not just the drawing of the circle, which in itself can be quite an operation. It's the activation of the circle once it's drawn. And here we get that whole component of force and form. The circle is the form, but you activate it with magical force. You have the tip of the sword that you touch the outer rim of the circle with, and as you're touching it, you're seeing like the white fire of your will activating the outside of the circle. Every pentagram or other symbol you trace with the tip of the sword, every divine name or name of spirit, working round sort of usually east to east, as you trace it with the tip of the sword, you're intoning those names. You're putting the power in that actually gets that circle activated. So it's not just an inert image on the floor. It is that powerful protection that you have empowered.
And that involves some species of visualization, correct?
Absolutely. You are. The way I was taught is that it's white fire is what you see being done, and that the other people, assuming you're working with more than one, just yourself, and there's other people there, are also seeing it and putting their energy into as well. They're all visualizing that happen, and that's something that is not really discussed. That, like we said earlier, concentration aspect of that you have developed your concentration powers so that you can have that focus and put that energy into that part of the practice.
Yeah, and it's interesting. Also, you're talking about activating certain materia magica or sigils, names, things like that. They kind of embody at that point somewhat of a talismanic nature, right? You're kind of that's part of. I really like the way you put it. The force and form components of that.
Yeah, it's very much. I mean, any ritual, it's at any point it's the balance of force and form, and that varies from time to time. But there's always both. You need form without force is inert, and force without form is incoherent. It doesn't have. So there always has to be that balance. And people, if you're just saying the words without doing anything else, it's at the risk of becoming theatre rather than practice. There has to be that power. I mean, things like the preparatory prayers and all the other stuff, you infuse yourself, you get into that energized, ecstatic state when you do a conjuration. It's not just a sort of like boring, monotonous reading in this sort of tone. You get really like when you're doing a conjuration, so that you really feel that power flowing, and you see that power flowing when you're doing it. And
Great.
that's why it can take a lot out of you, and why it's good to rest up usually at least the day after a conjuration, because oft times it can take a number of recitations. It's not going to just happen in 5 minutes. You might have to repeat the conjuration a number of times, and 2 or 3 hours is not uncommon for conjurations if you're going for one of the biggies, and that takes a lot of energy out of you.
Yeah. Wow. That's excellent actually to know. But is there anything else that you wanted to talk about, or because I feel like I'm really glad we got what we just did in, because that stuff is really, really interesting. And of course, to some degree, it's been my experience on these podcasts now, doing them for almost a year. It's the best conversations happen after I click the recording off. So I appreciate that.
I think something else, talking about the whole idea of force and form and the magical momentum, is how important it is to really get that magical momentum moving before you get to the actual day of the conjuration. In that sort of week of build up with, where you are focusing yourself, by the things that you abstain from, like the sort of the meat, alcohol, tobacco, all the things like that, not swearing so that there's no impurity in the voice because you're going to be uttering sacred names, be abstaining from social media and television and things so there's no distraction. All of that aspect of the preparation is also very important. If you go in, if you like, you just decide in the morning, I'm going to do a conjuration this evening, and you haven't had all of that time, the bathing, the purificatory stuff, say, for example, you might do the penitential psalms on the days leading up to it, the confession on the morning of. Without those sort of aspects to it, you greatly reduce your chance of success. So the preparation aspect is as important as the conjuration itself. Really want to sort of highlight that it's not just a casual thing. It's a big deal. If you're doing conjurations, they take a lot of time and energy to do if you want to have a good chance of success. And then with the best will in the world, sometimes even if you've done everything right, it doesn't always go according to plan. But that's where the perseverance comes in. If it didn't, then you have to try again. And I think for people particularly coming in, it's great to hear podcasts that do talk about the books, but if you can actually, pass on some handy hints and tips to people, because most people are working in isolation, and they see stuff, and the quality of material online can be so variable that if they've got someone whose work they enjoy, if they can then hear what that person's first-hand experience, then that makes, I think, life more interesting.
I appreciate the scholarly work. I think that's important. And a lot of you guys, particularly in the Grimoire tradition, really are doing the scholarly work, but you're also practitioners. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, there's some great academics doing things, but their stuff is very dry, and often because it's academic, it's within like this narrow band, and they don't look at it within a wider perspective, and they certainly don't look at it from the point of view of practice. So they can miss like nuances, or not actually understand necessarily the importance of what material they've got there.
Right.
And from that point of view, it's great that they're supplying the text, but we want the text and what you do with them.
Yeah, exactly. I was rereading. I'm in the process of putting this manuscript together, so I was going through all my resources, and I was reading Dr. Skinner's Techniques of Greco-Egyptian Magic again yesterday, and I forgot that he very eloquently sums things up with analogies sometimes. I think he put in the one of the introductory chapters, it'd be like somebody studying radios who didn't believe in radio waves. I was like, that's a really good way of putting that.
I think it's great with analogies. I mean, one of mine is a quite well-known author at one point commented about this series of conjurations in the Goetia and how it should only require one to get the attention of spirit, otherwise your will is failing. I thought that completely misses the point. I liken it more to somebody calling you on the phone on a landline. Unless you are sitting next to the phone, you're not going to answer it on the first ring. You've got to get from wherever you are in the house to the phone to pick it up. And each ring on that phone is like you doing a conjuration and then another conjuration. It's like when you hear a phone ringing, the insistence of it to answer it builds up. In the same way with conjurations, you build up the power of it until it's like, all right, I'm coming, for bloody hell, for goodness sake.
Yeah, that's another great analogy. Yeah, that's great. I might stick that in the podcast somewhere.
But unless you're incredibly lucky with the conjuration, it is going to take time. It's not just going to happen in the first 5 minutes. It does require that build up of energy and attracting, let's say, the attention of that particular spirit. That spirit might be busy doing its own thing. That's why they often have their legions of followers. I'll send one of my people to go and deal with this because I'm busy doing something else. Thanks very much. The secret life of spirits. We don't know what they're doing when when they're off in their realms, we can only hazard wild guesses. I did a talk in Cardiff at the conference there last Sunday, just gone. I made a comment, said, when you do your calling the watchtowers and summoning the lords and the watchtowers, said, I hope you don't think they actually turn up. Because what you're doing is you are creating a ward in their name. You draw your pentagram and say, a summon stone, call you up to guard with strike. So they're not actually turning up and being there. You're just using the power of their name as the rulers of those directions, to empower your thing. Don't think that they're actually turning up, because otherwise you think every full moon they're going to be, whose circle are we going to go to? You see people in your audience going, oh yeah. When you're calling up a spirit, it takes a lot more than just a few words to get them to turn up. You've got to put a lot more energy in. So that's like just creating a ward in their name. And there actually seem to be a few people nodding along as the penny dropped.
Yeah. That's excellent. That's good insight. Yeah, that's kind of, a little bit more of the realization that I guess I had in just talking to you about it. Obviously I'm doing things more like I guess you would call it the animation of a Yetziratic image or a talismanic image, where I'm using the letters of the name to create a talismanic, image that I project into the room, and then animate it with some species of that force. But it's,
there was a good book by A.C. Highfield in the 80s on the whole thing of creating with the talismanic imagery, creating the form using the talismanic imagery of the letters. I remember I can't remember the title of the book, but he did a couple of good books in the 80s that I think kind of been lost to posterity, which is a shame, because they were good, like solid magical technique books.
So do you have any other projects in the works at the moment? Anything? I know, this was probably somewhat of a massive labor for you, but I know how it goes with a lot of these in this community. We dedicate ourselves to these things, and they just take on sometimes lives of their own. So is there anything that any next project you're hopping to, or?
I am working on one, but I'll keep that under wraps until it's done, which is a smaller project. And then after that, I'll be working on volume 3 of the Grimoire Encyclopedia.
Wow, volume 3. Wow, excellent. So this is going to be an ongoing project for you.
Oh yeah, it's going to be like my life's work, really. It's like my magnum opus. I've got plans for what I want in volume 3 to expand the material further.
Great. So where can people check you out on the internet? Do you have a website? I know you have a website.
Yeah, I do. At the moment, I'm actually working on giving the website an overhaul. So at some point, hopefully this year, it will go out with like more material on. Like I want to put on articles, for example, that I put into anthologies and things that aren't necessarily in print anymore, that people might not have access to, and just try and put some more material out there that people might find of interest, and other bits and pieces like that on the website. Yeah, davidrankine.com. Very original name. But easy to find.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your day to speak with me, and I'm looking forward to everything else that you've got in the works. Thank you. Thank you for joining me.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.